Okay, so we start with, this is the lecture for Lab 9, which is the digestive system. And the focus of this lab, if you have your lab manual, is exercise 38 and then a couple of terms from 39. Obviously we're not going to be doing the lab as written in 39, but there's a couple terms that I need to make sure you know. So most of it is for lab 38, though, exercise 38, which gives an overview of the anatomy of the digestive system. As a reminder, make sure you have your study guide open while you're listening to this lecture and while you're reviewing and studying. Because remember, for the exam, every answer you write will be a term from the study guide. So there's not going to be questions about terms that are not on the study guide. But sometimes I'll have some on a diagram going through a review, or you might see in the lab manual or on the online Connect material. But if it is not in the study guide, it is not going to be an answer. So if you give an answer that's not on the study guide, and it just so happens to be a term that's near there, but it's not what I'm asking for, then you don't get credit for it. Okay, so for this slide, I just wanted to point out, obviously the digestive tract includes a really long connection of organs that the food will travel down while it's being digested from the mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, and large intestine. There are also accessory organs that will assist with digestion and absorption of nutrients. For each of one of these parts, from the mouth, the pharynx, esophagus, stomach, so on, in many cases you need to know more detail about these organs and structures as listed in the study guide. And remember that in addition to knowing how to identify all of these structures in the study guide on diagrams like in this image study guide, or in different images from different diagrams, but remember that you may also be tested on the exam for these terms, being able to identify these terms on pictures of models or on cadaver images. And so again, I encourage you to use the resources on Connect to look at the image, the practice practical. There's a resource that I put on Moodle to show you how to use Connect to find pictures of models and cadaver images and be able to identify terms on those, because some of the test questions will be straight from those images. So knowing how to identify them there will help you when you're studying. Okay, so this is a nice little overview, has a lot of terms. We're going to go through different parts of these. Within the mouth, the term oral or buccal cavity is that term that means that space within the mouth. Within the mouth, there's, on the upper portion of the mouth, there's a hard palate and a soft palate. The hard palate is made up of the palatine process of the maxilla, which is the upper jaw. There's a process that sticks outward from the upper jaw that's called the palatine process, and also the palatine bones, which are a separate bone behind the palatine process of the maxilla, but that are both part of the hard palate. Then you have the soft palate here, which is just made up of tissue, and then hanging down on the back is the uvula. It's not labeled here, but you can see it in other diagrams. It's that little hanging thing at the back of your throat. It's helpful to keep food and fluids from flying up into your nasal cavity when you swallow, because you don't want food up in this part of your nasal cavity. Notice, if you remember, if you notice from the respiratory system, we had talked about the pharynx. The pharynx, if you remember, they had a nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx, which is the three parts of the pharynx related to which area it's connected to. For the digestive system, you don't need to know nasopharynx because there's no food that should be present in the nasal area, but there should be food present in the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx, and so you need to be able to identify both of those. And there's salivary glands labeled on here, and I will come back and show these to you, but I want to show you first on a different diagram on the next slide. So there are three salivary glands. First gland I'll point out is the sublingual gland. It is called that because it's under the tongue. As you can see in this other diagram, here's the tongue, here's the sublingual gland. Notice that it's called the sublingual gland. There is also the lingual tonsil, which we talked about in the immune system section in Unit 2. Some people accidentally wrote sublingual tonsil, which I gave partial credit for. But it's sublingual gland, which is a salivary gland. The second salivary gland is the submandibular gland, and it's called that because it's under your jaw. Your mandible is your lower jaw. So you can see in this diagram here, submandibular gland. It's easy to tell the sublingual gland is a little bit more, if you look anterior towards the front of the head, and closer to where your tongue is attached, whereas the submandibular jaw gland is near to your jaw, so a little lower and a little further back. Then there's the parotid gland. It's found right sort of on the side in front of your ears. You can see it here. And so there are actually tubes that will allow these 3 different glands to secrete saliva and any salivary enzymes like amylase and so on into the oral cavity. But this is the location of these 3 glands. So, another part of the oral cavity are the teeth. For the teeth, I mainly want you to know the 4 types of teeth in an adult jaw. I'm not going to ask you about baby teeth, and I'm not going to ask you to tell me how many teeth people have at different ages. But I want you to know the names of the different types of teeth, and really by their shape and location. So it may help you if you know how many of each type there are, so you can count backwards. But really, if you can identify the shape and the location, it's fine. Also, if I just show you a picture and I ask you to name the tooth, then you can give me either their, the simpler name or the more scientific name that in the study guide I have a name and then a name in parentheses. You can give me either of those names for the answer if it's a blank question. But I recommend you know both terms because I might give you the name, one of the names, and say, what's the alternative name for that? Only 2 of the types of teeth have 2 different names. So the ones over here are called incisors. They're in the front, and they're like scissors, and they're going to tear the food. The next teeth back are the canines. They're also known as cuspids, and they're pretty pointy. They're not as pointy as you'd find in dogs and carnivores in general. They have basically one main point. So if you think of them because they're also known as cuspids, so you think of them as having sort of one cusp. The next teeth back are the premolars or bicuspids. You can use either term, so again, it might be easier to remember cuspid than bicuspid. So these bicuspids or premolars have sort of 2 different sort of, if you want to think of them as cusps or points. They're pretty good at grinding versus the front more teeth that are good at sort of sharper for cutting or tearing the teeth. The teeth in the very back are the molars, and that's the only name for them. And I'm not going to ask you to know, wisdom teeth and whether or not you'd have them in or not. Generally, molars are important for grinding food. Again, premolars, which are also for grinding food, but not quite as sort of bumpy. And then there's which are also known as bicuspids, canines, which are cuspids, and then incisors. Just like many of the other organs we learned about earlier in the semester, there are also 2 membrane layers surrounding the organs of the abdominal cavity. That cavity is called the peritoneal cavity. So you may hear like peritoneal space in between the 2. And there's going to be 2 layers, and as usual, the innermost or deepest layer is going to be the visceral peritoneum. Right? Just like all these others, visceral pericardia, visceral pleura. And then the outermost or most superficial layer is the parietal peritoneum. And so the parietal peritoneum is the easiest way to recognize is that it's going to be on the outer wall of the abdominal cavity. So in this case, peritoneal cavity is pretty large, you can see. And the visceral layer is the layer lining the outside of the GI tract, right here. While the parietal layer is lining the inner wall of the abdominal cavity and the other organs in the area. So all around here, anywhere that it's lining other organs, not the GI tract, and lining the outside of the stomach wall. The visceral peritoneum has another name. It's also named the serosa. And so if you take this little section here of a small intestine and you look and you zoom in and you sort of look at the histological sectioning of this, or a diagram of it, you can see this membrane here is called the serosa. It's also the visceral peritoneum. So just be aware that just like we had two different names for the layer of the heart, whether we were talking about the heart wall itself or the membrane, so like the visceral pericardium was also the epicardium, or the outer layer of the heart. It's the same idea. The visceral peritoneum is also part of the outer wall of the intestinal layers themselves. The terms that I'm going to talk about here will be the same whether you're talking about the lining of the stomach, the large intestine, the small intestine, at pretty much all the parts of the digestive system. So you'll see, other than that serosa, then you look inward, you'll see the next layer is the muscularis externa. Obviously just means external muscles, and it's hard to see here, and I don't have it labeled individually here, but what you'll see is there are two layers of muscle. Here you can see the muscle fibers that are, as you do this cross section, you can see the fibers lengthwise, and here you can see that you've cut into the fibers cross section of them. And so that's actually showing you the two different layers of the muscularis externa that is found along most of the digestive tract, from the esophagus, small intestine, large intestine. You're going to see two layers. They're called the circular layer and the longitudinal layer. This layer on the inside is the circular layer. You can see that those muscle cells are lined up so that they're end to end, and when they contract, they would squeeze the small intestine or esophagus or whatever. And these longitudinal layered cells, because they're going lengthwise, you can see over here how they would be lined up as the tube is going lengthwise. They, when they contract, are going to shorten the digestive tract there. What this is important for is it allows peristalsis, or movement of food along the GI tract. So the circular layer is going to squeeze that bolus of food, and the longitudinal layer will squeeze the tract to push it forward along the GI tract. This happens again, small intestine, large intestine, esophagus, but it is these muscle layers, all these layers are also found in the stomach, but the difference is the stomach in its muscular externa has 3 layers instead of 2. I'll show you that in another diagram. It's going to have these 2 layers plus an additional layer, but I'll show you that in another diagram. For the others, it's just these 2. It's always going to be longitudinal and circular. You don't have to know which order's which, just look at it. You can see if you can see the cells in a cross section, you know that these cells are encircling the organs, so they should be circular. And these, which when you're doing a cross section you just see that cut, they must be longitudinal. Deep of the muscularis externa is the submucosa here. And this is mostly connective tissue and blood vessels, and then inside of that is the mucosa, which lines the inside of most of the digestive system, and it's made up of a bunch of different layers. For lecture you might need to know more of the detail, but for me I just want you to know it contains a layer of epithelial cells that will be important for acting as a barrier for the digestive system, but also controlling digestion, so absorbing the nutrients. And also it has a mucous membrane that the secreted mucus from these cells will protect the cells that are lining the digestive system from being damaged by all of the acids and chemicals and enzymes that the digestive system releases in order to break down any food you ingest. Obviously, if you're ingesting food and trying to digest it, you're going to be trying to break down these proteins and lipids and sugars and so on. Your cells lining your digestive system are made of proteins and lipids and sugars. You don't want to digest those cells. If you break open that barrier, you could have an infection. And so the mucosa layer is going to be that physical barrier plus the mucous membrane that protects the cells there. I like to picture, also knowing the mucosa and the submucosa, it reminds me of the skin with the epidermis, which is all epithelial cells, and then the dermis, which is connective tissue and blood vessels. So if you remember that from BIOL210, the layers of epidermis and dermis, it might help you remember the mucosa is epithelial and the submucosa is connected with blood vessels. But again, I just mostly want you to be able to identify it in a diagram. You may need to know more about their function in lecture. So the other thing I wanted to say, I think that was all I wanted to say about that. Okay. So in the next diagram, what I'm labeling here, other than a couple of terms which are in other diagrams, are the greater and lesser omentum. Omentum are extensions of the peritoneal membrane that we talked about. The greater omentum is going to be draped over the intestines. It's sort of like a fatty apron, just sitting over it, helps hold things in and support it a little bit. And then the lesser omentum is found between the liver and the stomach and sort of connects the two. So they're more, just identify them in a diagram. So, remember when I told you that the muscularis externa has two layers in the esophagus, small intestine, large intestine. They have the circular and longitudinal layers. Well, the stomach also has those two layers, but they also have a third layer. That layer is called the oblique layer. Just like with your abdominal obliques, you can see it's going to run at an angle. This additional layer is going to help your stomach to churn its food when you're digesting. It will allow contraction in all three different directions to help with that digestion and mixing. In addition, in this diagram, you can see different regions of the stomach. You will see that the upper region towards the opening of the stomach from the esophagus over here is called the cardiac region. Then you see this domed portion at the very top is called the fundic region. That word fundic, you're going to see the domed portion actually of the uterus in the female reproductive system is also going to be called the fundus, which gets that name here because you can see this domed little top here. But this is the fundic region, this is the cardiac region. While we're over here, and then, actually I'll come back to this in a minute, the third region that I want you to know is the pyloric region, which is towards the bottom of the stomach, near where the food is going to exit into the small intestine. Notice that there's a sphincter here, and the sphincter, which is a circular muscle structure that's going to squeeze and keep closed food from going through here. It's called the pyloric sphincter because it's near the pyloric region. Basically, as the food is being digested, you want to keep the food in the stomach for a certain period of time and then release little bit of the food at a time into the small intestine so that it can be neutralized and digested evenly and completely. If all the food enters at once, it's going to overwhelm the small intestine and the digestive system wouldn't be able to work properly. So this pyloric sphincter can regulate that. There's another sphincter that's not labeled here because they don't have the cutout here, but it's on the study guide and I want you to know. It's called the lower esophageal sphincter. So here's the esophagus up here. The food would enter into the stomach here, and the esophageal sphincter actually is going to be closed to keep any stomach acids that have been secreted in the stomach to digest the food from coming back into the esophagus and feeling that burning sensation, because esophagus can't handle that. So if somebody has heartburn, the reason you feel that burning pain around where your heart is your heart is right above this diaphragm area, and the pain comes when this lower esophageal sphincter isn't working properly and acids get into your esophagus and you feel pain. Okay. So, in this next diagram, you can see how the food is partially digested in the stomach, and what happens in the stomach, which you'll learn about more in lecture, is it's going to mix with some hydrochloric acid and a digestive enzyme called pepsin, which is going to chop up proteins, and the mix of partially digested food at this point is going to be called chyme, which is where you get this word here, and just wanted to let you see this. I'm not testing you on that term, but I wanted to just mention that. It's going to be released into the small intestine. You'll see some accessory organs here which are going to release other chemicals that will help with digestion as the chyme enters the duodenum of the small intestine. The duodenum, I'll show you in another diagram too, is this first part of the small intestine. One of the accessory organs is the liver. And the liver is going to produce bile. Again, the function of bile you'll learn in lecture, but basically it's going to be important for transporting fats, lipids, cholesterol, anything that is hydrophobic that's in your food. It will help break it up and carry it in small particles. It's called emulsification. But again, you'll learn about that in lecture. That will then be able to travel and be absorbed in your bloodstream and then delivered to your cells. So this bile is very important. As the bile is produced, it's going to be stored in your gallbladder and then will be released when needed. When it's released, it will release, I'll show you the names of these ducts in another diagram, but basically the gallbladder's bile plus the pancreas is going to produce very important enzymes that will help with breakdown of food. The combination will be released into your duodenum of your small intestine as food is being added in. So as you're digesting your food, some of it will come through when the pyloric sphincter is opened, and then digestive juices and bile will be released so that it can be broken down. And so that will be important for breaking down food. There's also some, which I'll talk about, I might mention a little later, but bicarbonate, which will neutralize the really low acidity, well, the really low pH, the very acidic chyme. There will be buffers that will be released so that the digestive processes of the small intestine can work at a higher pH, which is necessary for them to work properly. So this is just a little cross-section of the liver itself, and I just want you to see something called the hepatic triad. Basically what it is 3 different types of vessels that are combined together so that absorption and release of nutrients can be transmitted throughout the liver. And again, there's a lot of complexity to the liver. I'm just trying to identify a few things on here. The green color is the bile ductule, which is going to carry the bile itself. Then there's going to be a branch of the hepatic artery, and then a branch of the hepatic portal vein. If you remember from when we talked about the blood circulatory system, I said that the hepatic portal vein is going to be important for filtering anything that you takes into your stomach, anything that gets into your digestive system before it goes into your regular circulation. So there's the hepatic portal vein, which is going to collect blood from your digestive system that's absorbed, and then that blood is going to be brought to your liver, and anything dangerous is going to be filtered out. So in this diagram is similar to the one I showed you a few slides ago, but it has some more things labeled. After the bile is produced in the liver, it's carried through little bile ductules, and then they're going to combine together eventually to what's called the common hepatic duct. And that common hepatic duct is then going to be merged with the cystic duct, and the bile can be stored in the gallbladder until it needs to be released. When it's going to be released, it will be transported through the bile duct. The bile duct will combine with the pancreatic duct, which is where all the pancreatic secretions will be released. Together, both of these will be released at the same time. At this, that food is being deposited into the duodenum. Again, these secretions include a bicarbonate to neutralize all those acidic stomach acids, and will release lots of enzymes that are important for breaking down food, and then the bile, which is important for transporting fats that are in your food. And you can see this is the first part of the small intestine, which is called the duodenum. In this diagram, it shows the entire small intestine with the stomach and the large intestine. So what you see is after the stomach, you have the first part of the small intestine, which is the duodenum. It's sort of C-shaped here. Then the whole middle portion of the small intestine is called the jejunum. So it's pretty much this whole area here, which is the jejunum. And then at the close to the end of the small intestine, it's called the ileum. Just so you know, I'm not going to ask you to know exactly where the separations are. So if I labeled like this area over here, I wouldn't label an area over here. I would either label this area and you'd know it's the duodenum. I'd label towards the end, which is the ileum, or anywhere in the middle I'm asking for the jejunum. And so at the end of this small intestine, you'll see what's another sphincter, and it's called the ileocecal valve. It's called that because it is a sphincter that is going to separate and control movement across between the ileum, which is the end of the small intestine, and the cecum, which is the beginning of the large intestine. So this ileocecal valve is going to be really important. You'll also see the appendix here at the end of the small intestine. Large intestine, sorry. Now you can see the rest of the large intestine. Again, you have that cecum, which is the very small portion at the beginning of the large intestine, right when the ileum connected. So the food, when it leaves the ileum through the ileocecal valve, the first place it will be is the cecum. After the cecum, luckily most of the regions are named for either their shape of the large intestine or the direction the food would go. So after the cecum, you have the ascending colon because it's going upward. You have the transverse colon because it's going across, and then the descending colon because it is going downward. And that you can see by the direction of the fecal matter that would be transporting through, what name it would have. Then you have the sigmoid colon, which is S-shaped. And then you have the rectum, and then the anal canal. And then here you can see another sphincter. It's called the external anal sphincter. The other thing I want to point out is in the large intestine, notice these, as you sort of have these little sections or segments of the large intestine. These are called haustra. Singular is called a haustrum. And that is sort of these singular structures that make up this large intestine. And then finally, I just want to mention for exercise 39, so what I just included some terms that I may ask you for on the test. These are the terms I want you to know. I know you need to know a lot more for lecture in terms of digestion, but I just picked a few. So for example, I may give you a description of a term and you have to give me the term, or I may give you an example of it. So for example, I may say, digesting starch into glucose is an example of what specific type of metabolism, and you'd have to say catabolism. And I always think catabolism, you break down things, so it's catabolism. Or I might even ask it a different way and say, what is the name of the enzyme that digests starch into glucose? And that would be amylase. Or what's the name of the enzyme that chews proteins from the amino end? It would be aminopeptidase. So something like that, but only the terms that are in the study guide. There's a lot more names of enzymes and so on, but I'm only going to ask you to know these so that I can get you to at least get a taste of it. Alright, that's it for the digestive system. And again, please, I recommend, other than doing the practice questions on Moodle, and doing obviously your lab quizzes and labs on Connect, I recommend taking your study guide and going onto Connect and looking at the models, the actual virtual models, and then also the Anatomy and Physiology Revealed cadaver dissection program. There is some information on how to use that on Moodle that I created to explain to you where to find those resources, because some images that will be on your test that won't be in the practice tests will be taken from those resources. Alright, thank you, good luck.